Hi everyone. In today's lecture, we want to talk about object-oriented, and you may find object-oriented is not really a computer science. It's not really data sciencey topic, and yeah, that's true. And the reason that we have to talk about this is probably you are not even noticed that, but we are doing object-oriented every day when we are doing data science programming, and then to have a better understanding about some of the entities, for example, data frame and NumPy in the array, and then we have to understand what is object-oriented programming. And I'm not asking you to create a huge object-oriented program by yourself, saying I'm not asking you to create a dozen of different classes, and for each class and there are a dozen of the methods. No, you don't have to do so. But when you are reading the official documentation, for example, and then you do want to understand what you are doing, and then have some understanding about the object oriented, and this will help you better read the official documentation. And let me use the data frame as example. So when you go to the data frame, and one thing probably you have seen me doing is dot shape. Oops, shape. Okay, and you will see in the class or in the documentation of pandas.dataframe, and then you do have a shape, and then for that shape, that is a shape as an attribute. It's not a shape as a method. So what does that mean? And say if you have a pandas data frame, and how do you get how many lines are there, how many columns are there? You do a data frame dot shape, or do you do a data frame dot shape and then parentheses, and then with parentheses or without the parentheses, what are the difference, which one is correct, and how do you know that? And well, of course you can try, and you can do Google searches, and then Google search will probably bring you to Stack Overflow, and there's nothing really wrong with that, but you gotta be able to understand the official documentation, because later in this course 522, and then you are dealing with some of the really complicated models with a dozen of the parameters, and if you do Google searches, and you have to read dozens of Stack Overflow posts, and a better way would be, how about you just like me go to the official documentation, and then you browse through what are the attributes inside, and how does the official documentation explain the parameters, and that's a better way. Okay, and then to do so we have to understand some of the basics about object-oriented programming. So let's start from the basic concepts. So a class, well, a class is a abstract definition of just two category of things, and as you can see here, attributes and methods, right, and then, well, sometimes we call them data or status or attributes, and then for the methods we may call them behaviors or actions. Okay, so for a class we just define those two category of things: attributes, data, status. So that's one thing, and then for the methods, behaviors, and actions, that's one thing. Okay, and then an object, and an object is an instance of a class. So we can build an instance using a class as a template. Okay, so let me give you an example. And when we are trying to define a car as a class, well, are we really defining one car or several cars? No, we are defining a car as a abstract data type, and for a car we say this car has to have a VIN number. Okay, this car has to have a color, this car has to have a state of registration, and this car has to have a make, the model, and then does this car how does this car power itself, gasoline or hybrid or electric. Okay, so those are the attributes of the car. Okay, and then after we have defined this car, we are saying those are the attributes that a car has to have. Okay, and after we have defined a class this way, and the next step will be, how about we try to get a specific car? When we are talking about a specific car, for example this green car, and then we say the color is green, and then the make and model is Ford Mustang, and then how it powers itself, it uses gasoline, right? So then for each of the attributes, and then we are trying to be very specific. Why? Because we are talking about a object, and that object is an instance of a class as a template. And then we do want to be specific when we are talking about a specific object. Okay, and then next, how do we define a class? Well, defining a class is not so hard in Python. Well, we have to use a new keyword, which is class, and then let's define a valid. Okay, so a valid is a class name, and then we do want to do a constructor, and for the constructor it defines what are the attributes that a valid has to have, and then we say a valid is going to have a owner. So we are going to take an owner, and then for this owner this will be assigned to self.owner, saying that is the owner for the current object. And then similarly I want to record how much cache does this valid hold for now. Okay, and then you may find this self is kind of weird. Okay, and when we are defining a method in a class, and then the self should always be the first parameter, and then when we are doing the self dot owner, and then we are saying for the current object of a class, and then it has to have an attribute called owner. And then how do we define the owner? When we build an object, and then we are going to rely on a parameter owner to be sent to the constructor, so that the self.owner will be this owner, and the same thing, the self.cache will be this cache. Okay, and then for the underscore in it we call that a constructor. Okay, and then after we have the constructor already built inside the class, okay, so I wouldn't say this class is finished, but this syntax is ready, and then at least we can build a valid. And then how do we build a valid? And remember, to build a valid we have to send in two things. Number one, the name of the owner, and number two, how much cache are there is there inside the valid. So we say, okay, we want to build a valid, and then I'm sending in two parameters, and Tom and 10. And then if we want to access the attribute of a valid, we do valid dot owner. Okay, so when we do valid dot owner, and then this valid is the object we just created, and then for the dot owner we are using the dot attribute name to access an attribute, and then we are gonna get Tom. So hold on for 1 second, let me ask you this again. If we have already got a data frame, and then we want to get how many rows and how many columns are there in this data frame, do we do data frame dot shape or data frame dot shape parentheses? Okay, let's go to the documentation again, and then we say this shape, right? This shape is here, it's the enter attribute. So how do we get the attribute of an object? The syntax is here. So we do data frame dot shape, no parentheses. We are getting the shape, and then that shape is an attribute. Okay, so well, after you understand the basic syntax about object oriented, and then when you are doing the data sciencey work, when you are touching a data frame, and then you will understand what you are really doing. Okay, and then the next question we want to talk about is, what's the difference between a method and function? And just now probably you know, well, I started to use the word method. Like for this one, this is a constructor and this is a method. Or if you go here in the data frame, and then you see we do have a bunch of the methods. And then what's the difference between the methods and function? And for a method, one thing you will see is a method is defined underneath, or inside a class definition. Okay, so when we define a method, we have to do that inside a class definition. And another thing is, well, when we are defining a method and then we are doing a self first as a parameter, so that is one of the big difference. And another thing is, when you are calling a function, you just call the function. But when you are calling a method, and for example, say if you want to do the ABS, okay? So when you are doing the ABS, and then you have to do a data frame dot ABS parentheses. So that's the difference. So when you are doing a method call, you have to call that from an existing object. So you have to do object dot method name. But when you are calling a function, you don't have to do that. So those are some of the differences. Okay, and the next question. What can we do with classes? Well, you can define some methods. So, well, you have to use the def. So def works for both defining of the function and the defining of the methods. Okay, and then you can do inheritance and overriding, and then that is really too computer sciencey, so I won't talk about that. And then, well, you can do a defining a public protected or private instance attributes, and later we are going to talk about that. And that is doable in Python, but not the same way as some of the old school programming languages like C++ or Java. Okay, and then you can define static methods and static class methods, and then you want to you also should know that Python has a garbage collection system. So, well, if an object is no longer used, and then you don't really have to explicitly delete that to release the memory, because Python will do that automatically. Okay, so let's build a few more things to the valid. So class valid, we are creating the valid as a class, and then the constructor exactly the same. But now we want to add two more methods, so two more actions that a valid can have. Number one, spend. You can spend the money, and when you spend the money, and then you have to take an amount, and then I'm going to subtract that amount from the cache. So self.cache and then minus equals amount. So I'm taking this amount away from the current cache of the current valid. And then for the earn, and then I'm adding this amount to the cache. Okay, so now I have two new methods created. So now this is a very quick exercise. I'm gonna go through that, and then I'm gonna pause now. Okay, and then you want to create a valid for Amy, and for Amy, that's the owner name, and then the initial cache is 60. So create a valid for Amy, and then you want to say, okay, Amy, you earn $50, and then you want to increase the cache by 50, and then you want to use this earn. Okay, and then you want to do another spend, and then you want to spend $99, and eventually you want to check the remaining of the cache in Amy's valid. So I'm going to stop this video now and go ahead and try to do this part of the code, and I will see you in the next video.